Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone on Zoom. Thank you for your patience. Good afternoon. My name is Emma Lewis. I am the Museum School and Lecture Coordinator here at the Springfield Museums. I'd like to welcome you all to today's presentation. Finish the Rail Trail, Completing the Mass Central Rail Trail from Boston to Northampton, presented by Craig Della Penna, Board President, Norwaddock Network. Please join us next week for the presentation, Nyana LaFond and Portraits in Red. We want to invite you to contribute questions to Ask LaFond, and we're accepting them until May 9th. You can send us any questions to the email lectures@springfieldmuseums.org. I would also like to invite members to join us after today's presentation for continuing conversations. Join history docent Bob Abel on the first floor in the Automobile Gallery in the Wood Museum of Springfield History, where he will discuss the development of the railroads and Union Station in Springfield, highlighting some of the famous people who passed through Union Station. Bob, are you here? All right, you can follow Bob after the presentation over to the Wood Museum of Springfield History. And finally, it is my honor to introduce Craig Della Penna. Craig Della Penna is the board president of Norwaddock Network, a 25-year-old 501c3 nonprofit. Today, Norwaddock Network is working to reassemble the former railroad corridor from Northampton all the way to Boston, making it the longest rail trail in New England. Craig has given lectures in 21 states on various topics related to the conversion of former railroads into linear parks. He has authored 5 books and contributed to newspaper op-eds and book forewords. In the past few years, he has been featured in books as a case study in various realms, such as innovative marketing, creative branding, and the courage to quit a cubicle job to only do the things that you love and not do the things that you don't. He and his wife, Kathleen, also operate an award-winning bed and breakfast that sits 8 feet from the rail trail in Northampton's historic Civil War-era industrial village of Florence. Please remember to silence your phones and help me welcome Craig Della Penna.
Thank you, Emma. I'm very, very much honored to be here today. I've always admired the work of the Springfield Museums, and one of my good friends also, Lyman Wood, is affiliated with this project here. Let me just start by saying that I used to market rail freight, and I used to stand up and plan the operations of several of New England's largest and most successful railroad-owned transloading facilities. I worked for the Pinsley Railroad Company, which was the country's first short-line railroad operator. So I know how to make a railroad work. And railroads that don't work anymore must become trails. And it was back in the February of 1994 that one of my customers, we were transloading antique topo maps for him. And he picked up a book on my desk called The Lost Railroads of New England. And he said, you know, they're taking a lot of these old rail lines and converting them to bike and hike trails. And I said, yeah, I'm a member of Rails to Trails Conservancy. And he said, so am I. But they've never written a good book like this with the history. And so I have a background in railroad history. And he and I chatted, and we came to the conclusion that his main line of business was not the old obsolete topo maps converted to stationary. His main line of business, he was a publisher of outdoor recreational titles and guidebooks. And he said, if you were to write a manuscript on this subject, I'd publish it. So we went out and bought bikes, hadn't biked in years. Biked every mile of every open rail trail the summer of 1994 in New England. The book was a big hit. So much so they put me under contract to do 2 more books. One about New York, one about New Jersey. That meant going to those places every weekend. Our lives were consumed by the production of these books. These are highly detailed in terms of every bit of railroad archaeology or railroad history you're going to encounter along the way. Boy Scouts were using them and Girl Scouts too, as treasure hunts to find things along the way in their neighborhoods they never knew were there. And then I started hearing about people opposed to the rail trail in places throughout southern New England, there was pushback. The densest network of dead steam railroad corridor, by the way, in North America, if you did not know this, is within 150 feet of where we are right here in the Connecticut River Valley. And they're all becoming linear parks and places that create a renaissance in communities. And so I started going to some of the meetings. I have, as I said, a background in history, but I had no idea about the politics. And so I started going to meetings, and I watched in Southampton, Massachusetts, actually the corridor our company owned, they were going to sell it to the town for a discounted rate, but people were opposed to the idea, and they actually voted it down. The only community on the entire corridor between New Haven and Northampton to vote down the trail. And on my way out the door, I said to the lead anti, I'll be back. Like Arnold. And I'm going to have lots of little tweaks here that'll teach you about things for the context of movie characters. And I said, I'll be back. And I'm going to resurrect the project. So they voted it down in 1996. A year later, I was hired by Rails to Trails Conservancy part-time to be the point person in New England, to parachute into all the wars. I'm a battle-hardened veteran of every rail trail war within a couple of 100 miles of here. And what does that mean? Well, that means there were people that really were fervently opposed to this idea of conversions, and they were very much in tune that they were going to win. And there was about 10, 11 places that voted down the trails in the 90s here in Massachusetts. And true to my word, I worked for Rails to Trails for about 7 years. In fact, I was the first paying tenant, Worcester's restored Union Station. And I used to let Mass DOT and MBTA have meetings with CSX about who had control of dispatch in my office, in my conference room. And it was filled with flying F-bombs. They hated each other. CSX is not loved in the railroad world, and I know that from my experience there. But the fun thing was that I would go into all these wars and get to know the antis, and over time, you know, they were impressed that I was talking to them, number one, and number two, they were always focused on the value of their house. They were convinced that their houses would be devalued so much they'd be upside down, not be able to sell their house. So when Rails to Trails scaled out of the region in 2004, what am I going to do next? I'll become a realtor. Not merely a real estate agent, by the way. There is a difference. I'll be a realtor, and I'll specialize in the sale of houses near rail trails. In 1996, I had my first lecture on this subject. Today, I lost count. It's over 1,200, close to 1,500 lectures in 21 states, including lots of red states that take 3 years to build their rail trails. This has been underway for 45 years. How shameful is that? I'm going to curl your hair today. There will be no pictures of people biking on rail trails. There will be no pictures of grandiose stuff and beautiful things seen from the rail trail. This is all about the policy geek world that I travel in. And the guy that just came in, Galen Mook, he'll talk to you about he's the head of Mass Bike, came out here from Boston to hear this. And so this is going to be not your traditional talk here today. So I'm going to spin this up. And, oh, I got to use the little clicker, right? Okay. Where did this Nowatic network come from? Well, this is Interestingly, the Nowatic network was formed in the last days of the Clinton administration in like 1999 or so, or maybe 2000. It was a step over into the new millennial times, into the 21st century. All states shall have a contest. The contest will pick the best trail in the state. There were 2 entries here in Massachusetts. One was the Bay Circuit Trail, like in between 495 and 128. And the fact that they needed a rail with trail section of an MBTA-owned corridor allowed the MBTA to nix the idea of them. So the only candidate left was the Nowatic network. And when they won, the one chosen, they called me and said, what do we do? I said, well, you got to form a 501c3 to take the big gift from American Express. And then you got to figure out what you're going to do. They had no idea. They never expected to win. And I was on the board for the first couple of years, and it was fun. The plaque there is the award they got. But how do you pronounce that? And it's really Nowatic, okay, Nowatic. It's an Indian name meaning in the midst of the river, in the Connecticut River, in the Whately, Connecticut River area. That's the sort of like ancient name of the locale. Today, I'm going to connect the dots for you. Like Steve Jobs once said, you cannot connect the dots by looking forward. You only can connect them by looking backwards. Here's the 1922 map. 1922 is significant because that's the high water mark of railroad construction in southern New England. During World War I, the railroads were nationalized because the oligarch-driven railroads were not playing well in the sandbox, not interchanging traffic properly. And so the railroads were nationalized. And then the federal government made the biggest mistake ever by giving it back to them. And then that was like a game of Pac-Man after that. After 1922, chomp, 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 all the hundreds of railroads are being acquired by other railroads. And the process just ended last year or a year before, where CSX bought Pan Am, the former B&M Railroad, and this is what we have left now. There's only 2 big railroads, Class 1 railroads in the east. This is only steam railroad corridor, by the way. If you put trolleys in here, that doubles the mileage. I can reassemble dead railroad corridor, steam railroad corridor. That sounds like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Well, it's really, you have to have patience. Trolleys are almost a waste of time trying to reassemble those. I don't bother. Though there is a guy in Central Mass that I help him do this because he's in it. He's in it to the end. 75% of this network has been formally abandoned, and half of that is being transformed into linear parks. What is being built out today as trails is going to be the densest network of dead steam railroad corridor now to be rail trails in North America. It's going to be transformative. It's not like anything else you've ever seen before. This 6-step infographic that sits here, I'm not going to go by step here, but this will show you step by step how this came to be. That link works. This is going to be in the chat, and you'll see step by step. If you've ever been to Falmouth on Cape Cod and gone on the Shining Sea Trail, that is where everything started. There was a couple of trails in the Midwest that got built out a little earlier, but this one is the most impactful one on Cape Cod because Barbara Burwell, whose son, David, watched her go through 10 years of trials and tribulations, and the town ended up using eminent domain to buy the corridor, so alarming the state government that they stood up 2 laws to give the state a right of first refusal and a say in construction near corridor. And they also, in 4 transactions, bought everything inside of 495, every live railroad and every dead railroad inside of 495. 495 is a big, big metric. Here I am in Springfield today, a gateway city. I grew up in Holyoke. when Holyoke was the wealthiest place in Western New England. One of my books I've written about Holyoke is in the top 10% of sales worldwide, because there's Hoyokers all over the United States who are interested in Holyoke stuff. Outside of 495, there are many gateway cities that are forlorn and in trouble, coming back to life now. This is why I do this. These trail projects are not for the glamorous suburbs. They're not for Deluxeberry, Snooton, Swellesley, or even Sudbury, where neighbors dropped in $600,000 at a case before the SJC to fight the trail. There's professionals out there fighting this stuff, unbeknownst to most of you. This 6-step infographic lays it out step by step by step, and how the state came to own more miles by triple of dead railroad corridor in the United States. Little tiny Massachusetts. All the railroad corridor now is protected. It happened, the bad thing was it happened a little earlier than the environmental movement started. They didn't know where to put this agency inside the Transportation Secretariat. And trust me when I tell you that I live and breathe how agencies operate. There is not an inch in the DNA in anybody inside of DOT anywhere, not just Massachusetts, that has any protecting entity or any protecting theme. This agency that protects corridor lives inside DOT. That's not good. It needs to be put inside the environmental agencies. But you go at this, they even got an interview with the state rep who created the laws a year before he died during the pandemic, but he lives on here. What happened after that thing took place in Falmouth, David Burwell grew up, became an attorney. He founded Rails to Trails Conservancy. He was getting calls from the Midwest where farmers were having a hard time coming to the idea that the trail that bisected their farm or the dead railroad is going to become a trail. And the American Farm Bureau fought all the trail projects in the Midwest. And so David was getting calls for assistance. He was an attorney for the National Wildlife Federation. So he stood up Rails to Trails Conservancy based upon what happened in Falmouth. Step by step, the Transportation Secretariat bought everything inside of 495. 4 transactions, 40 communities, buying all the dead railroads inside. Only inside of I-495 though. And this little link will link you to that infographic. Here we are, 870 miles of dead railroad is owned by Massachusetts. Most of that is inside of 495. National Grid owns about 200 miles. They were the old, I think it was called Mass Electric years ago, and they used to buy dead railroads because it was a linear thing, and they're a linear company and sort of like made sense, and here we go. And so this is very impactful. 2 corridors were bought by the State Parks Agency outside of 495 because there was a couple of characters who worked for DEM who were visionary and who knew eventually, years later, that the state only buying inside 495 was going to cause a mega inequity thing, and it has come to pass. They bought 2 corridors, one on Cape Cod, making the Cape Cod Rail Trail, and the other one was here in Western Mass. Terry Blunt was a land acquisition person. He's passed away since. But he entered in a 5-year negotiation from 1975 to 1980, 45 years ago. The state acquired the corridor in Northampton to Amherst. They call it the Nowatuk Rail Trail today. There we go. One of the interesting things about Hadley, Massachusetts, I'm full of useless information that you probably never knew. Look at this. Hadley has the oldest continuously operating farmland in North America. Can you see there all those narrow strips of land? Deeded strips of land only a few feet wide, because that's what the farmer with an oxen pulled plow went up and back, or maybe 2 passes, and it gets recorded forever. And that long vertical stripe there on the right side, that's the longest town green in the United States. There you go. And it's bisected by our trail here. There you go. How did this idea of a 104-mile-long trail come to be? In 1999, the State Parks Agency, used to be called DEM back then. Jennifer, I forgot her last name. She led this effort. They cast out the idea of trails and greenways as linear things. And really, in 1999, they're talking about new millennial, 21st century. These are the 21st century parks. This lives on that website. In fact, there's a number of things on there. The idea of the Mass Central Rail Trail came about because of Ed Yaglu, who was part of a group called Wachusett Greenways, which was stood up in 1995 on the center part of the corridor here in the areas Barry, Oakham, Rutland, Holden, West Boylston, that area of Massachusetts. And that's land owned by the DCR watershed people, and they don't want paved trails. They want water going into the ground rather than running off. So they won't allow the trail to get paved. But Ed Yaglu was on the board, and he called forward this idea of the Mass Central Rail Trail. When the trail project in Belchertown was voted down in 1996, the same town meeting season, and it was voted down in Weston, the Commonwealth Beacon magazine, if you've never heard of that, if you're a policy geek like me, that's where all the big new ideas are discussed in Massachusetts, Commonwealth Beacon. Commonwealth Beacon did a story that fall, well, it was actually a spring later, about the oddity that 2 towns in Massachusetts voted down the rail trail. Who could be opposed to this? And it's part of the 3 stages of truth. Have you ever heard of that? 3 stages of truth. The first stage, people will scoff at your newfangled idea. Oh, that'll never happen. The second stage is where they'll be virulent dead enders fighting to their last breath. And the third stage of truth is where we've entered largely today. Who could be opposed to this? And in my real estate practice, I meet people all the time who don't believe me when I tell them that these are controversial things. And so it's convinced me that I have to do a memoir here. I'm like Forrest Gump, a witness to iconic events, and I'm the annoying Rain Man of rail trails. But I've got a million stories. I'm not going to tell you them all today. But this image here, 2000, a linear thinking land trust was stood up. When the loss was a narrow loss in Belchertown took place, one of my battle-hardened veterans didn't go melting away. He took and bought 2.5 miles of the corridor from the B&M Railroad for $100,000. Then shopped it to a couple of conventional land trusts. If you didn't know, Massachusetts has more land trusts than any other state in the United States, except for California, which is 20 times larger. I go and teach land trusts how to break out of the rectangular mode and think linearly. I've stood up 6 linear thinking land trusts in New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts over the years. One of them is in Belchertown, because when the conventional land trust didn't want to touch the radioactive rail trail project, Dan said to me, what do I do next? Well, that's easy. Set up a linear thinking land trust, stack the board of directors with linear thinking people, and buy the corridor when you can, as you can. That's it. So they did. Year after year, they'd buy more. when the rail trail war took place in Belchertown, 0 miles were in public ownership. When they retired the Belchertown Land Trust a couple of years ago, they donated all their holdings. The corridor in Belchertown is 10.5 miles long, the biggest in square miles on the entire corridor. Belchertown is 10 miles. 7.5 miles have been donated by the land trust of the town. They're now coming forward with state grants to move that forward. 2005, I received the tip that I actually have leaks in the state government. I have still 6 leaks. Some people have died, but I still have 6 leaks in the state government to this day. They told me that you have to get into Hardwick, Craig, because the corridor is going to be sold and the DOT won't buy it. I said, okay, I'll stand up a land acquisition vehicle. We'll call it Central Highlands Conservancy, kind of a joke name. And I'll buy the corridor. So I did. We held it for 2 years and then gave the East Quabbin Land Trust, one of my hybrid land trusts who'd broken into the linear world, go into a capital campaign to buy me out for my cost plus expenses. Brilliant idea. But the fun part is I'm going to go meet my new neighbors who are frothing at the mouth angry that I could do this and they couldn't. That's because I'm a geek and I live and breathe this stuff and you don't. And so they bought me out. By the way, it was 3.2 miles and there were 3 bridges there. Yes. One was the last of its type still standing in New England, the Pony Trust Bridge here. There I am way in the background. And when I worked for Rails to Trails, I was doing 900 miles a week. Galen, you'll get a kick out of this. So I was staying awake by eating Hershey bars, not crashing. And so I gained a lot of weight, but I lost 70 pounds since I worked for Rails to Trails. But that's one of my bridges. They have an annual New Year's Day hike. There's the Pony Trust Bridge there is on the left, a conventional truss bridge is on the right, and then there's the approaches to this is a bent timber bridge, and there was a trail actually built in southwestern Virginia by the National Park Service because there was 37 bent timber bridges there, and so they're an attraction. People love to go and do this. In 2006, I was biking across the state with a travel writer from the New York Times. And we came upon a piece of corridor in Berlin, Mass. Don't call it Berlin, Berlin, Mass. Place you probably never heard of. It's right on 495. In fact, the state had to go back and buy a corridor in Berlin on this corridor because it was outside of 495 and they only wanted to do it inside of 495. They had to buy this one because they wanted to put a staging yard for train sets for commuter rail in this community. And they decided that they were never going to do that. And so it's just sat dormant for years. I'm biking across here and the tracks on MBTA-owned corridor are always there. If it's owned by a private real railroad company, they remove the rails. Owned by the MBTA, no. And so we come upon this theft of the corridor here, where somebody had taken a diamond tip cutoff saw, dragged out the 30-foot section of track, bulldozed out the berm, creating a flag lot in the real estate parlance. That is, they cut their way through the dead railroad to connect to a street behind the car there, to put in a driveway, to reach this modular house under construction. So I took pictures of it. I sent it to the privatized real estate department of the MBTA. I said, you can't defend your own effing land. And I knew them all. You need to lease this to DCR. And to my surprise, they did. I was breathless. I couldn't, a month later, a lease was being sent in there. Don't forget, I've got all these contacts inside the state. And that was right when Governor Patrick was coming on board there. And the new head of DCR saw this lease agreement from the privatized real estate department of the MBTA that treated DCR like a lowly municipality. If you didn't know, there's a hierarchy at play here. And so the lawyers at DCR would not allow him to sign that lease. Treats us like a town, you know. We're not a town. We're a like government agency. There's that angle in the background going on. So for 4 years, that guy, the head of DCR, commissioner, waited. That thing never moved off his desk until he was elevated to be the Secretary of Environmental and Energy Affairs. He signs the lease on his last day on the job as a DCR commissioner, goes into the interoffice mail, comes back to work on Monday, 1 floor up, into the inbound mail it comes, and he signs off on it. And then they send in smooth talking Dan Driscoll from the old MDC, dealing with all the myriad of little towns inside of 495, inside the Boston area. He was given the task of going to, this was called the Wayside section of the Mass Central Rail Trail. The corridor itself is 26 miles long, or excuse me, 104 miles long, 26 different communities. He went to the 6 communities that make up the Wayside section and said, Weston, I know that you voted it down. We're in charge now. We're going to build the trail, but we're going to do you last. We know you voted it down. We're going to let it get built out in other places, and we'll do you last so you can touch it, see it, feel it in other places, and make sure you like it. And then a couple of weeks later, Eversource says, we've got a great idea. We want to underground the grid. We want to rip out the track structure, dig a 15-foot trench, 7 miles long. We're going to concrete it. We're going to lay the cables in. We're going to have manholes come up to grade. We'll backfill it. DCR can come in and pave it, landscape it. A winner, said with a Boston accent. And there was pushback in the town of Sudbury. They did not like that idea. They liked the idea of the 50-mile gone in the woods rail trail, dead railroad corridor sitting there. They did not want to have the trail nor the undergrounding of the grid, and they fought it all the way to the SJC. One of the things I do is herd cats. I put together teams of lawyers to fight significant cases inside that go to the SJC. The second one I did was in Sudbury. It was when the grid fell apart in Texas and people were dying at 30-degree temperatures because they never invested in their grid and undergrounded it where they could and where they should. The antis lost. The neighborhood dropped in something over $500,000. A lot of spare money hanging around there, and they lost. And so the trail is now actually under construction right now. In the last 2 years, Eversource has been undergrounding the grid. And there's other thing there. There's not only is this 100-mile trail being developed, but there's 18 other intersecting trails. One of the more interesting and significant intersecting trails in Eastern Mass is one called the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. That was an old New Haven branch line that went up to Lowell. And it's a north-south oriented corridor intersecting with the East-West Trail in Sudbury. And they're going to preserve the diamond, which allowed trains to pass over one another on the intersection. Right there at the intersection, they're going to preserve that. And that is one of 18 intersecting trails. So now for the next 10 years, DCR grants and other things to prioritize the Mass Central Rail Trail. It became apparent that this is, it looks like it's, we can throw small pots of money at it and do little bits each year and let's see where it goes. And over the years, it's just unbelievable how it's starting to shape up here. On our board, we have a cartographer who's done this masstrailtracker.com map, has all the trails in Massachusetts, and the one in the westernmost section, the westernmost intersecting trail is the New Haven to Northampton corridor. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. In 2017, Charlie Baker's administration stood up what's called Mass Trails Team. There's several agencies in Massachusetts that have a role in creating rail trails. He took down the silos between 3 of them, not all of them. There's still a couple more left to go, and we don't really have courage seen to take down the other silos yet. I'm ever optimistic. But this is something very amazing. They stood up Mass Trails. Mid-level staffers from 3 agencies were ordered to meet twice a month inside the governor's suite of offices, where the governor or lieutenant governor would sometimes sit in on the meetings to inspire the people at the mid-level staffers to move these things forward. If you didn't know there were silos between agencies, you learned something new today. But believe me, there were silos. But this has supercharged the trail development in Massachusetts. Not all the silos, I don't think I'll get more into that today here, but they became aware, like, can this thing actually be done? Oh my God, there's still corridor out there that's been sold off that we've got to claw back. There's other complications. We went from 0 miles open in 1975, and for 45 years, the state's been giving out these relatively small chump change, I'll call them, grants to build the easy to build, low hanging fruit sections. In 2020, during the pandemic, DOT said, oh my God, we're at 60 miles open now. And they could see over the horizon, so to speak, that a lot of the easy projects are all done. We're going to run out of cheap projects. We're going to be expensive projects, bridges over 600 feet long, 1,000-foot tunnel needing to be renovated. There's things that need to be done that we don't know can be done. We don't know. And so they commissioned a report. Here's the bridges. That's the 800-feet bridge on the left that's in Berlin, Mass. That was stripped out. All these bridges are gone. This is in Berlin, Mass, in the area called Five Corners, which is a really scary place to bike if you're forced to go down there. The top right picture is in Belchertown over the Swift River. On the right side is Bondsville section of Palmer. Left side is the Belchertown, now down near Shea Avenue. And the railroad track on the bottom there is actually an old Boston and Albany branch line that came out of Springfield here, going up to Athol. A lot of that is under the Quabbin Reservoir today. The bottom picture is at Clinton, Massachusetts, 135 feet tall above the reservoir. And the background there is the Wachusett Reservoir Dam going into a tunnel on the right there. This is the 1,000-foot tunnel in Clinton, unbeknownst to most people of the 21st century. It's under renovation, initial partial renovation now. So during the pandemic, DOT came up with a report that says, yes, it can be done. Oh my God, this is going to be expensive. They came up to me and said, we're at a junction. We know it can be completed, but which way shall we go? Should we price up the cost to finish, or should we do a report on how much it would produce if it gets finished? And so they said, we're not doing the cost report until you take your 501c3 and do a report about how much it's going to be worth. And so we did. Here it is. This is the RFP we sent out. You can put that in there too, Emma, this shows what it's going to be worth. Report's out. Report says completing the Mass Central Rail Trail will bring 4 to 5 million users a year, 950 just in Worcester County. 64% of the population lives within 10 miles of this. 400,000 to 500,000 overnight visitors. $200 million a year in economic impacts. Our report is based upon what happened in New York. 10 years ago, the Erie Canal Trail was 75% complete and was producing 250 million plus a year, about $750,000 per mile. When that report was given to Governor Cuomo at the time, he commanded DOT to build another 400 miles in 4 years, creating the Empire State Trail. Our report shows $2 million a mile. And just a few weeks ago, after our report came out 20 months ago, DOT's just begun the costing of the report. The costing report, see how much it would cost to finish. So what is next as it come near the end here? One of the intersecting trails that will be the most impactful intersecting trail is the one that goes from New Haven to Northampton. And we have here today Bob Madison. If you want to raise your hand, Bob, who is the author of a book called, what is it, exact title? Oh, wow. What a coincidence. NHNCG.org, if you go to that website, that talks about the details of that. That used to be a canal, and the canal craze years ago, that then became a railroad, and it's mostly converted or being converted to a trail today. And Connecticut has the best trail census in the United States. That is to say, who's using the trail, where they're coming from, why they're there, how often they're there. It's the program through Yukon Stores, Connecticut. And they have all great data on everything going on in the trail world in Connecticut, including this one. But they've never asked the basic question, what is it going to be worth? And so we, the Watica Network, are about to take this task on. We've already done it once. And now that our report came out, I'll be honest, and it's totally based on Boston area population densities and demographics about coming across the state to the west here. This trail will be about people from New Haven, or excuse me, from New York City coming to New Haven. And that's going to be a game changer. So DOT is costing up the report right now, how much it's going to cost to finish the trail. And there is a site called finishtherailtrail.org. And so we've entered into a fiscal arrangement with New Haven and Northampton Canal Greenway Alliance. We're raising the money to get the impact underway. And so this has never been asked before in Connecticut. Local foundation here has matched me up. So we're on the way. The same company who did the report called about the East-West Trail, Cambridge Econometrics, is this study as well. So this is what's going on here. And if you want to talk about, before I end here, a little anomaly here in Springfield. How many people here from Springfield? Couple people. Here's the master plan, what had been the Highland Division Rail Trail from the old New Haven Railroad branch line. This is 1997. This is what the Highland Division Rail Trail looks like. It runs right through Springfield. Comes off the main line at Gasoline Alley, Joe Sebelia's project there, next to the CSX main line. Goes all the way through town like a giant question mark, and goes all the way to East Long Meadow. Inside of 495, everything's protected. Outside, nah, yet, nada. Here we go. Buckle your seatbelt. Two exceptions. I told you the on side of 495. Here's the experience in Springfield. In the late 90s, a predecessor entity to the Mass DOT came along with about $100,000 of $1990 to plan and develop the trail along that old branch line. And as they were dealing with some neighborhood opposition to new scary newfangled idea, a rail trail, the Rail and Transit Office at Side Mass DOT was notified by the railroad that there was a pending sale of that right-of-way. Rail and Transit Office followed the rules, canvassed the city, the regional planning agency, other state agencies. Does your agency have an interest in defending this corridor? Here's what happened in Springfield. They all said, hell yes, we're planning a trail there. You better not allow that to be sold off from underneath us. They did. Not once, but twice. How many people here remember Linda Petrella, Director of Planning in Springfield? After this, she got sick and she passed away. This is blasphemous, terrible, disgusting stuff that happens elsewhere in communities outside of 495. I told you I was a geek. I run FOIA requests, over 40 to 50 FOIA requests over the years. I run FOIA requests on my name, Freedom of Information Act, to find out who's writing hate mail about me. Really, this is it. This is what I do. Springfield's famous in the transportation policy geek world is the only place in Massachusetts unlucky enough to have the Rail and Transit Office allow for sale of old corridor at the same time the corridor is actually funded to be converted into a trail. There's the end for you right there. I have time for questions if you who dares to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Secondly, who's in charge of all the maintenance on the rail trail, you know, or the company's towns that are going through, mowing, weed whacking?
Yep.
You know?
Okay. Southampton was voted down in fall of 1996. I told them I'd be back. I went back in 10 years later and resurrected the project. The Southampton Rail Trail is radioactive. We rebrand projects to become known as greenways. Like the Springfield project should be not Highland Division Rail Trail, should be Crosstown Greenway. That's what it needs to be. In Southampton, they stood up a Friends of the Greenway. We met monthly for 4 years, had in a public place with speakers who came in to talk about how their community built a trail, a community that looked like Southampton, how they built the trail. And they eventually voted for it. And they built a real friends group and a subset of the municipal government. And they're now designing the trail, will be under construction shortly. Maintenance, the trail I live next to, built in 1982. They just paved it this past fall, last November. 42 years. Had never been even an inch of maintenance, really. They plow it in the winter now, 20 years in after it got built. There was so much utilitarian use, kids walking or biking to school is not a rec use. And so they plow it, but it's now been rebuilt, first time in 42 years. There are groups that will stand up friends groups that do maintenance on the trail, like cutting weeds and doing things. It's a very good community building exercise to have locals be able to do that. Or some places just make it part of the park infrastructure to maintain like that. And it's not a really heavy lift. And scale of things, the change it brings to communities is beyond a rectangular park. These linear parks are used much longer in the day for a lot wider use of people. And so, yes, sir.
List the uses
rail trail, what are they actually used for?
For recreational purposes, you mean like walking, biking, could be, some places snowmobiles where it's commonly seen as sometimes the snowmobile groups are part of the infrastructure. ATVs are generally not seen. In fact, when I was meeting my new neighbors in Hardwick, in Gilbertville section of Hardwick, I said, so what do you want to see? Tell me what you don't want to see. We don't want to see ATVs. Your wish is my command. I will not allow ATVs on there. And it's true. People don't like ATVs. Snowmobiles in places where they're part of the four-season infrastructure, you can't tell snowmobilers you can't have that be on our trail. And so you're gonna see those in places that commonly see them now. It's not in urban areas, it would be in rural areas. Motorized wheelchairs that are fine. E-bikes, class 1 and class 2 e-bikes. Those are the slower, more pedal assist type of modes. The class 3 ones with the big fat wide tires that are throttle only, no pedal assist aspect, those are not allowed on rail trails. Yes, sir. No. What was the second part? Well, we'll do the first part. It does not devalue property. If you go to the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, which is brucefreemanrailtrail.org, on there has been stood up every single report ever created in North America about property values, impacts by proximity to a rail trail. There is no negative impact.
We have a few questions on Zoom if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, sure.
One question is, did the railroad end at Northampton or only the trail?
The Mass Central Rail Trail ended at Union Station in Northampton. There was a branch line that continued west. It was the New Haven Railroad's Williamsburg branch that went to Williamsburg. Originally, it wanted to go to the Berkshires to catch up to the Hoosick Tunnel line there to get through the Hoosick Tunnel to points west in New York, but it never got past Williamsburg. There's a branch line there. Yes, sir.
Best guess as to when the trail from Boston to Northampton will be completed?
How much courage is there in the State House? Could be three. The plan that's being worked on right now should be out in a couple of months. The project fast side 3 years, likely 7 years. They're going to break it into bite-sized chunks and get money, you know, once we get past the drama in DC now and return to normalcy. These are projects that create a renaissance in places. And so they're not newfangled things that are frivolous, little silly things. These create a renaissance in gateway towns. Yes.
I mentioned Berkshire County just a minute ago. There's the Ashwaubenon.
That's the fastest rail trail ever built in Massachusetts. Now, I was at the ribbon cutting for that.
Oh. Wow.
I've written 3 books on this subject. Yes. And that is going to be expanded into Vermont. And eventually, not soon, eventually, the currently active railroad between Greenfield and the Berkshires will be accommodating a rail with trail, because when CSX bought it, there's nothing left to buy, okay? And so we just have 2 class 1 railroads that don't like each other, Norfolk Southern and CSX. They had to put a railroad between them in many places so they don't interchange freight between each other. They stood up a company called Berkshire and Eastern, which says it all right there. They're not going west through the Berkshires to connect with to Norfolk Southern.
Or is that not a thing? There's no.
Yes, there will be a way. There'll be a rail with trail built, starting at Damon Road in Northampton to go up along the Connecticut River through Whately, and then Deerfield. Deerfield has an old dead railroad that goes up to Shelburne Falls. That will then connect with the east-west rail. When the freight traffic diminishes west of Greenfield, there will be a rail with trail put in alongside the active railroad today. Years ago, when I first started on this journey, I was one of the participants in the creation of the first book written about rail with trail. That was when there was only 30 or 40 around the country. There's now 400 right now, over 400. There will be a rail with trail. That's how you're going to get the Berkshires.
We've had about 3 people in the Zoom chat ask about the Westfield connection and how that would connect Northampton and the New Haven.
Okay, that's
the Northampton Canal Greenway finally.
yes. See, that trail from New Haven to Northampton over the past 30 years has been under development, had 16 different names. That's a New England thing. We have no counties, we have no regional thinking. And the state governments really look down on municipalities. We'll give you money to build your trail, call it what you want. We have no vision of what it's going to look like when it's done. And so there was a woman in Southwick who created this idea of changing all the names to distill them down to as few as possible. And the project in Westfield, when I used to work for Pinsley Railroad Company, managing the entity called Railroad Distribution Services, the corridor in Westfield running north-south was damaged by a city of Westfield trash compactor truck, which hit the bridge square on with a power takeoff unit from the trash truck, broke the bridge, never to see rail service again on the south side of Westfield. That's when the idea of the rail trail took hold in Westfield. They've been on it for probably 25 years now. And what's about to happen there on the north side of Westfield, when I told the state too, they should have bought the Pioneer Valley Railroad when John Levine was closing down Pinsley and the Pioneer Valley Railroad, the last of their short line companies. I told DOT, you have to buy this. It's only $20 million. You can have a national rail with trail demonstrator project. You need to do this. They didn't. They then got sold to a company that was stood up in Florida at the Jacksonville campus of buildings that houses CSX headquarters. And they bought the Pinsley name too. So they're now operating the Pinsley operation there in Westfield on the north side, and they're going to make what they can of it. But the state has identified a route around that corridor, effectively low volume country roads, to get to the Southampton, and there'll be a couple of mile gap, but it's not going to be dangerous, busy roads. And that's how they're going to get to Southampton. And then everything else gets built out there. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. They put a lot of money in there. They've gone over three railroad trusts in town.
It's like the High Line. Have you heard of the High Line in New York City? It's elevated above. Right.
It just had trail just stops there.
But it will continue on. It's not forgotten. It is going to be continued because they know that building these trails out with off-road bicycling opportunities is the winner. Whenever you have a gap where there's on-road connections, that's where use will diminish. There'll always be like a choke point there. They'll throttle back traffic, and they want to have as much traffic as possible to have some of these gateway communities, little forlorn, forgotten, frail places come back to normalcy. This will cause a renaissance in downtown Westfield beyond what's there now. That Westfield section is like the High Line in New York City, one of my projects as well. And elevated right of way right through an urban core. It's a winner. It's a winner. Yes, ma'am, way in the back. Yes.
What basically came down to one of the stories was that there was a fear of cutfile.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Robbers, muggers, rapists, and thieves. And I'll never be able to let the woman who owned our house before we bought it. She was a leader of the opposition way back in. She was very much afraid that pedophiles were coming to snatch her children. Yes. Williamsburg, the first go around was in the 80s. And people fought it off. It was too newfangled an idea. And then a more robust, resilient friends group was stood up. But in the countering balance, there was actually an anti-group that was tied in with a national property rights group that fought the trail. And they voted it down by a slim margin. And the National Grid, well, when the war first broke out, the corridor was owned by Mass Electric. And then became owned by National Grid, an English company who owned a lot of projects in New York, and they just couldn't understand the to-do in Williamsburg. And so they settled the 2 days before or day before it was scheduled to go to the SJC. It was all about who owned the land. And it was actually settled in an incorrect way that we know now, looking back at it. It was actually the utility didn't do it in a way they should have. They merely said that they were going to give the corridor to the adjoining landowners, who like to call themselves abutters, because most projects that come to your neighborhood make you feel like you're in the gutter. So if they want to call themselves abutters, and gutters rhymes, that's, you heard that here. And they fought it. They prevailed, and then they sued the utility. There were 23, I think there were 60 adjoining landowners. I'll never call them abutters. There were 60 adjoining landowners, 23 were litigants in the lawsuit. The utility gave them, the litigants, their bigger, better backyards. One of them took that to mean that they could clear cut the forest behind their house all the way to the river's edge. Did you know that in Springfield here, Mass DEP has a regional office? All regional offices of DEP have an environmental crime strike force. How many people have heard of that? I'm the geek. We sent in people to take pictures. We then alerted the environmental crime strike force of the crime. Letters were written back and forth. 10 years. How sick is that? They actually prevailed in the end, making the adjoining landowners who damaged the landscape. They made them replicate it. And, you know, I'm not going into Williamsburg anymore because since I became a realtor, and I specialize in the sale of houses near rail trails, I was approached by, well, the first one, there was 2 transactions. The first one, we watched one of the litigants in the lawsuit who owned only land there from the border in Northampton all the way 1,500 feet into Williamsburg, big parcel of land. He sold part of it to a woman who was going to build a 2-family house. We watched that transaction take place. When she's under construction, we knocked on her door. Did you know what you bought was also 1,000 feet of the dead railroad? Oh, no, I didn't. We'd like to buy that so we can ensure that the trail gets built someday. I'd love that. We made a deal for $5,000. And in the dead end in the woods. You cannot build something, federal rules cannot build trails, the dead end in the woods. It has to connect to a public street. And I'm patient. We bought the corridor. And then 2 years later, a woman calls me to sell her house in Haydenville section of Williamsburg. And I look at it on the map. Oh, that borders the now town-owned land in Williamsburg. And by the way, it was called Friends of Northampton Trails, a friends group, and the city of Northampton, who bought the corridor in Williamsburg. Yes, that is not the first time that a community has bought dead railroad corridor in a neighboring community to build a trail. And so what happened is Northampton cleaned out the title, and no more mysterious title there. They cleaned out the title and then offered it up to the town at town meeting as a gift, free. That's what they understand in Williamsburg, free. And they have to get, and if you didn't know this, if you don't live in a town, in Massachusetts towns, you have to get the 2/3 majority in order to do anything good or anything bad. So nothing changes. That's why it's so popular here. You come and it doesn't look like other places with huge subdivisions, right? So in Williamsburg's case, they voted 85% in favor to accept the gift of land of 1,000 feet of the dead railroad. And then 2 years later, I list a house that borders the backside. And I said to my seller, you know, on the left side of your property, you own a cart path along the Mill River that goes up to the railroad in the back. And she said, yes, Craig, if you could find a buyer, I would, just at closing, I would carve that off and gift that to the town as an easement. And so now I hear from people, how come I'm not in Williamsburg? Because I've already shown you twice how to do it. I don't need to do it anymore. And I'm serious. They could reassemble that corridor. Instead, they're coming off of this little jog that I helped create. And by the way, the town voted 88% in favor of that second. And the antis pulled out all the stops there to try to do this. And in fact, one of the antis years earlier was doing lectures at conferences for Tea Partier conferences back in the days. And I was featured as an evil, malevolent character. Right? That's how impactful I am. In any case, they could finish the trail up there. I've done my job.
I think we're just about time, but I had another question in person. I had a question online of how can people get involved and donate? What's the most effective way to participate in this project?
The Watic Network is not a membership organization. They can donate to their local trail group. They can donate to Mass Trails. Those are membership organizations. And in fact, I'm going to be standing down from the Watic Network because I effectively see us. I can read the tea leaves. We're at yes now. We're at yes. And I'm backstopping this by having the report about the North-South Trail add in to our East-West Trail. They cannot stop it now. So I'm going to be working on my memoir. I'm going to be expanding my lecture series. And I'm going to be in the background doing things in the State House and in state agencies that I couldn't be doing if I was a member of the Watic Network board. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Just got the stuff up here, tell people to come get it.
Oh, yes. I have brochures here for people who didn't know about the flyer, about the trail, about bed and breakfast there. And sorry.
It's okay, I'll ask you now.
Yeah.
The listing of